Hey DCC fans and RPG historians, I'm Sam with 3D6, and if you recognize any of the literature out here in front of me today, then you might know we're about to have a conversation about Appendix N. So Dave and I have been brainstorming various introductory videos to acquaint new players with Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG. And the more we brainstormed, the more obvious it became that the best starting point would be a discussion of the backbone of DCC, which is of course Appendix N. If you're new to the game, whether as a complete newbie or maybe you're coming from 5th edition or some other system, while researching DCC, you've probably seen mentions or references to an Appendix N. And if you haven't already Googled it, then you're probably wondering what the hell that is. At its most basic, the answer is that it's a list of books and stories that inspire Dungeons & Dragons. And if that's all you wanted to know, then feel free to stop the video right now. But if you're interested in how Appendix N shaped D&D and why it's important to the creation of DCC, then stick around because I'm going to go into more detail about what exactly Appendix N is, what some of its common themes are, why it's important to DCC, and lastly I'm going to talk about how to go about actually reading Appendix N for those who are interested. Additionally, I've provided a link below, it's in the description, to the Goodman Games website where they have just the entirety of that appendix reprinted, so you can go ahead and look at it if you're unfamiliar with it. I'm very briefly going to go into some history of Dungeons & Dragons just for the complete novice, but basically, Gary Gygax co-created Dungeons & Dragons with a guy named Dave Arneson. Gary also wrote the first edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide, which released in 1979. At the end of this book, there are a series of appendices. They're each labeled with a letter of the alphabet, A through P, for 16 appendices in total. And most of these appendices are random tables or other tips for adding more flavor into your D&D campaign. There's a 2-page list of herbs and spices if you're interested in that. Appendix N, however, is different. If you've got a first edition DMG on you, it's on page 224. If you don't, find the link below. Appendix N is titled Inspirational and Educational Reading. It's essentially broken into 3 parts. The first section is an introductory paragraph that just goes into how Gary talks about his love for fantastical stories came from his father reading to him as a kid, and how being an avid reader of science fiction and fantasy helped inspire D&D, and basically that he's providing this list of novels and short stories in hopes that it'll inspire any would-be dungeon master who's wanting to create a campaign for their players. The second section of Appendix N is the list itself. The list refers 29 authors in total, and it calls out 22 novels and stories by name. He also recommends 13 unique series of novels or short stories, and those can range anywhere from 2 to over 10 books. For several of the authors listed, he effectively recommends that you read every single thing that they ever wrote. So I'm sure you can already guess that this is a pretty expansive list. So much so that I actually considered trying to tally up the total number of works, but I decided that I didn't even have the time. The third and final section of Appendix N, he calls out 6 specific authors as being particularly influential on the creation of AD&D, and goes on to say that he hopes you enjoy and are inspired by all the works that he's recommended. And that's it. Personally, though, I think it's awesome that this comparatively simple appendix in a book that was written 40 years ago that most of the players at the time didn't even notice was in there is still a big part of the modern RPG dialogue. So now that we know what Appendix N is, I want to talk about some of the common themes and how they helped shape early D&D. When you think about D&D, especially if you started playing sometime in the last 20 years of the game's 45-year history, you probably think of a fairly generic medieval European fantasy setting. And you're not wrong. D&D's been such an influential force on modern culture that the mechanics of the game are the basis for nearly every computer RPG ever made. It's influenced every fantasy novel or movie since its inception, and with all of this influence, Dungeons & Dragons has become self-referential, meaning that with each new edition of Dungeons & Dragons has defined what Dungeons & Dragons is. So essentially, we're 4 generations removed from the source material of Appendix N, and that original message of D&D is getting lost like a game of telephone. Why does any of that matter? Well, if you look at Appendix N, the predictable fantasy mainstays like Lord of the Rings actually make up a pretty small percentage of what's recommended. And in fact, I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn that pulp writers of the 30s and 50s are the most heavily influenced. I can't say that Appendix N is X or Y, because thematically it can be so many things, but most of these stories are hard to pin down genre-wise because they existed before genre was a specific box that you had to check. It wasn't, sci-fi as spaceships, robots, and ray guns, and fantasy as knights, dragons, and magics. You never mix the two. In Appendix N stories, it's not uncommon that you could start out on Earth, travel through a portal to a distant planet, and ride a dinosaur to a wizard tower at the center of that planet and stop the wizard from making a death ray for whatever reason. It doesn't have to make sense, it just has to be entertaining. Additionally, most of the stories are episodic in nature, mainly due to the fact that they were originally published in fiction magazines, Weird Tales being a notable one. And these episodic stories draw parallels with old D&D adventure modules, in that the conflicts are often very localized. You weren't being asked to embark on a globe-spanning quest. You would just walk into a town and say what evil thing needed killed, and they'd point you to the direction of the nearest dungeon. This is a huge theme in sword and sorcery fiction. Take Conan, for example. Even though in these books, he eventually travels the world and becomes a king, but in each individual story, it's very local, and the reason we read it is to see how Conan deals with the dilemma at hand. Spoiler alert, it's usually bloody. So by now, you may be asking yourself what any of this has to do with Dungeon Crawl Classics. And if you've seen our previous video explaining DCC module enumeration, you might remember us saying that DCC started as a line of modules written for 3rd and eventually for 4th edition D&D. With the commercial flop of 4th edition, Joseph Goodman, the founder of Goodman Games, he was compelled to go back to the roots of D&D, the roots. And he apparently read every single thing on Appendix N, which, as we discussed earlier, is no task for the faint of heart. He took these themes and motifs found in Appendix N literature, and using the Open Game License, he applied the philosophy into a modified version of the D20 rule set, which resulted in the product that was DCC RPG. And this is a game that really captures the spirit of role-playing the way they did it in 1974. So, as you can see, DCC and Appendix N go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And I also don't want anyone to think that I'm saying that you have to read Appendix N in order to fully appreciate DCC or D&D for that matter. I do think it's important to know where these games came from and how we got to where we are in the world of modern tabletop RPGs, though. So hopefully some of you are inspired to begin your own journey through Appendix N, though maybe you don't know where to begin. It's understandable. There are hundreds of works contained on this list. And it should be obvious that how you read it shouldn't really matter. Just pick a book, pick an author, pick a series, and just start reading it. But if you're like me and you want to have some sort of game plan as to how to tackle this thing, then stick around, because I'm going to break down some of the ways to look at how Gary presents the works and what the entries on the appendix actually mean. For the first example, let's look at the very first entry. The author is Paul Anderson, and the works recommended are 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, The High Crusade, and The Broken Sword. So for the sake of a Appendix N study of Anderson's writings, just read the 3 books listed and that's it. If you're compelled to read more, great, but for the sake of Appendix N, just worry about those and don't worry about anything else. For a second example, let's look at the third entry, and that's Frederick Brown. This entry simply states the author's name and gives no further guidance as to what works to read. In this case, you can assume one of 2 things, and that's either that Gary recommends that you read every single thing that Frederick Brown wrote, which is upwards of 300 stories, or 500 probably. Or he's maybe telling us that you could essentially throw a dart at a list of his works and you'll be happy with whatever it lands on. My personal strategy here is just research what the author's most notable works are, maybe find a collection that has that and some other stories, and read that and call it a day. For the third example, let's skip down the list to Fritz Lieber, whose listing says Fafhrd and Greymouser series, et al. The et al here definitely signifies that Gary recommends reading anything and everything written by that author. But this comes with a caveat that brings me to my next point, and that is, don't worry about reading anything published after 1978. Many of the authors mentioned had careers that continued well after the publication of the DMG in '79, and many of the series listed continued as well. Fafhrd and the Greymouser series, for example, they had a final book that was published in the '80s. For the sake of my Appendix N read-through, that book's not even on my radar. The same can be said about the Harold Shea series as well, and those continued into the 90s. These fall into the category of Appendix N adjacent. These can be things written in the appropriate era with the right themes, but they're just not on the list for whatever reason. They could be modern works that pay homage to Appendix N literature. They can be works by Appendix N authors that aren't on the list, or they could be written after that 78 cutoff. They could also be books mentioned by Gary himself in articles or interviews as being influential on D&D, but didn't make the list. An example of that would be like Bram Stoker's Dracula, which he mentioned in Dragon Magazine, predating the DMG as being very influential. So then, where do you start? Earlier I mentioned that Gary references 6 authors at the end of Appendix N as being particularly influential. Those authors are Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, Jack Vance, H.P. Lovecraft, Abraham Merritt, and lastly, DeCamp and Pratt, who are actually 2 authors, but I'm lumping them together because listing them lumped together makes me think that he's only talking about the Harold Shea series that they wrote together, as well as the Carnelian Cube, and not about their individual publications. So I'm counting them as 1 for the sake of simplicity. I started with these authors before moving to the rest of the list. It worked well for me. Your mileage may vary. Honestly, I'm only concerned with reading the novels or stories that were called out by name, the series that were called out by name, and then for any of the authors that it just has their name listed without anything else, I'll find a collection of their stories or whatever their most notable work is and read that. I'm not a completionist. I'm not going to worry about reading all hundreds and hundreds of works that are going to be included on the list. And with that, this wraps up our discussion of Appendix N. I'm sure that I missed things, so feel free to put me on blast in the comments below, or let me know what your favorite Appendix N works are, or which ones fell flat. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Remember to always roll up like it's 1974 with 3D6. I'm Sam, and I'll catch y'all next time. Later.